Okay, so you guys already know how these deck guides work. For those of you who don't, it's basically broken down into 3 parts. 1, basically I go over an overview of the deck. 2, I go over changes you can make to the deck. And 3, although this case it's not going to be changes you can make to the deck. This even Warlock's pretty standard build. And the third one is all of the matchups and mulligans that you'll need to know to win. So without further ado, I will just jump right into it. This Warlock deck is actually pretty solid, I'd say, but it takes a lot of time to master. Basically, it can be an early beatdown deck with an early Mountain Giant to beat down control decks. It has potential taunts and control into aggro decks, but you have to, in those matchups, you have to be a lot more conservative with your health, which is something that I didn't learn until later on. So my win rate with this deck is only like 50 to 52%, but that's fine because it's starting to get better because I'm realizing into aggro decks, you don't always need to life tap, and this is just a general tip that I'm giving you guys right off the bat. You don't always need a full hand. If you're playing against an aggro deck and you have a ton of cards in your hand that are useful, like if you already have a Hellfire and a Spellstone and the Hooked Reaver and like a Homunculus, and you already have a ton of cards in your hand that control the board and help you, you don't need to take the 2 extra damage, because I've lost games by like 1 or 2 health, and that probably boils down to like one time when I life tapped and I didn't need to. So you don't always need to life tap into those options, but really you can control the board with this deck. It can be an early beatdown deck. You can really go into the late game and grind games out with Gul'dan and the demon synergy in this deck, and it's just such a flexible deck. The only issue is it can get blown out early, and if that happens, there's nothing you can do because health is a resource. And that's basically the biggest part of this deck, and why Control Warlock and this deck are kind of complex, is that you have a whole other resource that most classes don't have, and that's health. You actually use health not just as a way to protect yourself, but as a way to like draw cards. It's a resource. You use it to play some of your cards. You use it to draw cards. And you also have heals. But if you don't draw those heals, sometimes you can get wrecked, which is why you need to sometimes be more conservative with the matchups. So that's basically it as an overview of the deck. And I will just jump into the matchups right away, because as of changing the deck, there are some things you could do. I guess if you want to get real technical here, some people run a build where they go 2 Scavenging Oozes to deal with weapons in some classes and some matchups, and some run a Doomsayer, some run Bone Mayors if you want to take a card out for a Bone Mare. But generally speaking, there aren't any major changes to this deck that you can make to make it better or worse. I actually think that this build is pretty optimized. So I'm just going to jump right into the matchups, because that's the thing that I think is the most important. And basically into Control, early game 8-8 wins you games single-handedly. Like, they will have no response, and if they do have a response, and I'll get into that in a second, you can still do stuff to win the game. And then there is the aggro decks where you have a ton of control options, but those are kind of hard because since you use health as a resource, if you don't have a ton of taunts to put up in front of you right away, it's kind of rough. But I'll get into that when I talk about mulligans and specific matchups. So, Druid. Control deck with very limited, like, hard removal. He has a Spellstone that does 6 damage, which can't kill a Mountain Giant. He has Naturalize, which can make you overdraw, but at the same time, he has to have it. And you have Skulking Geist, so if he doesn't have it right away, you can coin into Skulking Geist turn 5 or something like that and really mess him up. And you draw way more cards than he does too, so it's more likely that you get a Mountain Giant than he gets a Naturalize. And if he has both, then you'll overdraw like 1 card, which is something you need to keep in mind. You have to always keep in mind the fact that your hand might be too full. It's probably one of the other things that I was confused about with this deck. I've never played a deck where you always have like 8 cards in your hand or more. So sometimes I'd overdraw myself. Like, I'd literally just life tap and be like, wait, now I have 10 cards, I'm going to overdraw next turn. Or I play Mountain Giant with 9 against a Druid, and then he naturalizes and I overdraw 2. So that's something that you need to keep in mind, and that's why Druid actually kind of hurts, because you can sometimes burn very useful cards. But if he doesn't have the Naturalize, it is a free reign. What's he going to do? Summon 1/5 taunts with a Spreading Plague against like 2 8/8s? Okay, you immediately deal with them and then keep going face. Like, there's nothing he can do against that. You have a very good early game, potentially. And late game, you can really drag games out with Gul'dan if you need to. And yeah, if he stalls games out and goes like Mechathune, not great. And if he goes big taunt and blows you out, and you only have a couple of minions on the board, that's kind of sucky. But really, this matchup's actually really good for you. Hunter is bad for you. He has a hero power that does direct damage to you. He has a ton of early game power. Secret has late game power too, especially with Rexar. Same with Death Rattle. You can just get blown out so fast all of a sudden. Death Rattle's the best matchup for this deck because you can silence a Death Rattle with the 2 silences in this deck. But other than that, such powerful early game options as a Hunter. Like in Secret, Dire Mole, and then adapt Dire Mole, make it a 2/4. He's a 2/4 and a 3/2, or like a 4/3 if he gets the attack option, and a 3/2, and then he plays the Animal Companion, and you're like, what do? I could coin out Hellfire maybe and save me, but I'm already at like 16 health. He just burns me down at this point. So it's not a great matchup. And the same thing for Mage. Tempo Mage destroys you, because even if you get taunts on the board, a lot of his damage comes from spells. So that makes it even worse than Hunter. Because Hunter, you can block the minions, although he has his hero power. You can block the minions. Mage, most of it's burn spells and damage that way. And then into Big Mage, it's a bad matchup too, because he has a ton of options to deal with your just 8/8s. Because you'll play a big bomb card, and he'll have an option to deal with it. Or he'll have taunt, or he'll have freeze. And it's just kind of rough. Both of these matchups are probably your 2 worst, and it really sucks that they're like 2 of the most popular classes in the game right now. I think I played more mages than any other class, which is weird. I didn't know mages were becoming so popular, but maybe I just got unlucky and I'll start climbing and play against less mages, but I don't know. The only matchups that's worse for you is Warrior. Odd Warrior specifically. If you get Skulking Guys, you keep that. This is the matchup where you keep it. Also Druid. You keep Skulking Guys into Warrior and Druid that try to get rid of their 1 mana removals. If you don't do that, then you're probably going to die. Those are the bad matchups. I already talked about Druid being a good matchup. You beat Warlock because he beat Zoo, because you can beat them down with an 8/8, and since he uses health as a resource too, your early beatdown actually does a lot. And you have a ton of ways of dealing with the board. And the difference between Warlock and other aggro decks is that he has to, like, once he uses his stuff, he takes a turn or 2 to recharge after he dumps his hand. So if you can deal with that initial dump, you actually have like a turn where he has to life tap and kind of set up, which means that gives you a chance to play like a 7/7 taunt or something to regain control of the board. And then into even, it's a mirror match, but I think I'm pretty good at even, so I won that most of the time. And into like control, he doesn't have the mountain giant play, so a lot of the time you'll be able to just burn him with that, because he will be using health as a resource. He's going control, but he won't have a response to your 8/8. You just kill all of his minions with that and start building up a board and then kill him. So yeah, Rogue, this deck beats Quest because you have a lot of way of dealing with wide boards, so you can kill his stuff before he pumps them all up and makes them 4/4s, which is helpful. You get an 8/8 out, so really you get to beat him down, unless he gets the Quest with the Glacial Shard and freezes all of your big minions. You're probably going to win, because if he does it with charge minions, what does he do? He kills maybe 1, and then has nothing, and then you hit him with like an 8/8 and a 4/9 and like a 4/4 too. Like, you just have such a good board that he can't deal with it as a Quest Rogue, especially if you pop off early. Into Odd, the damage is actually pretty rough, but if you start off with a Vulgar Homunculus or a Plated Beetle, it's doable, especially with the Vulgar Homunculus being able to stall for sometimes even 2 turns rather than just 1. Paladin is a pretty easy matchup for you. He just goes wide, you deal with wide boards with Defile and Hellfire, and then you build up a mountain giant or a big minion yourself, and then you can't do anything about it. Priest and Shaman are pretty even matchups, I'd say. Pretty like 50-50. Same with the Rogue, but I'd say Rogue, because you beat Death Rattle, and you beat Quest, and you beat Miracle, Miracle has Sap, so maybe not Miracle. Miracle's probably a decent matchup. Probably around 50-50, but I'd say Rogue in general is slightly better than 50%. And then Priest and Shaman are about 50%, because they have the options, you know? Like, Shaman has a Hex, which is just an objectively good option to deal with big minions, and then he has Shutter Walk and has tons of little things. Like, if he goes even too, it's hard to deal with even Shaman, because he gets such a wide board. Maybe that's just because I didn't have a lot of removal options the 2 games I played against it and lost, but it might just be an unlucky small sample size. Like, the sample size is 2. It's very possible that I just got unlucky, but I think that it's rough, especially with Shudderwalk being, like, as strong as it is as well against this deck, because if you're not able to beat him down, he's able to stall out for a little bit, and then Healing Rains. He can just start to build up his battle cries and then Shudderwalk and win the game off of that. He has some heals, he has a lot of taunts, he has the Serenite Chain Gang, and that's just 2 minions they have to get over with a minion. And if you have Hellfire, it's fine, but it's actually kind of hard. And then into Priest, you never know what deck the Priest is going. Shadow Word Death is a pain in the butt for the Mountain Giant. And he gets to heal up, so your beatdown isn't as effective. He has Psychic Scream, which puts everything back in your deck. And if he Psychic Screams after you Gul'dan, you have no way of, like, redrawing all of those cards. So if he Psychic Screams in response to a Gul'dan play, that's actually really bad for you, because you can't actually draw cards and rebuild your board. So it's a little sucky. But I do think it's still a 50-50 win rate, and because of the fact that Priest is just not in a good spot right now, even though it has some options to counter you, I don't think that it actually really wins super hard. And the last thing is into Druid. Token Druid is a really bad matchup for you. I hate to say it, but it is. It's the one Druid matchup that's bad for you. So I'll get into the mulligans real quick, save that for the end, because saving the best for last, I guess. And basically, it's going to be not into specific classes, but into specific like deck types. And it's basically going to be aggro and then everything that's not aggro. So aggro, you want to keep the 4/4 taunt, the Hooked Reaver. That will potentially become a 7/7 because you'll get burned down in the beginning, and by turn 4 you might actually be able to play him. And if not on turn 4, on turn 5 for sure. You want to keep the Vulgar Homunculus and or Plated Beetle. Maybe not both, but at least one. To stall out a little bit. And you want to keep the Spellstone and board wipes of any kind. Into this, Mountain Giant's always good to have, but I wouldn't mulligan for it. Because sometimes you mulligan a Hellfire, you're like, oh, I don't need a Hellfire, I don't need the Hellfire, for example, or a Defile into like a control matchup. I'll mulligan to try to get a Mountain Giant. You don't want to do that in this case. If you have a removal, Mountain Giants are helpful, especially if you can play an 8/8 on turn 3 or 4, but I would not prioritize them into aggro matchups. I would prioritize more removal. Because on turn 4, I would much rather play Hellfire and wipe his board than an 8/8, and then take, like, 12 damage as a crackback from his minions. I would have just rather played the Hellfire and then played the Mountain Giant on a later turn. So, it's useful, and if you don't have any other options, Mountain Giant's fine, but with all the card draw that you have, you'll probably draw one eventually, and it's much better to have a guaranteed removal in your hand rather than like a big minion. Into aggro. Into pretty much everything else, you keep the Mountain Giant. You also keep the Spellstone because a lot of the things have, a lot of the decks have at least something big that you want to remove at some point. So Spellstone is actually still pretty helpful, but you don't necessarily want to keep as many low drops. Mountain Giant is huge. Twilight Drake is pretty decent. A 2-drop if you want to keep a Homunculus, because that can proc the Spellstone if you need. And let's see here. Anything else that's a super priority keep as a Warlock? Into aggro, sometimes a Doomsayer is good too. Into everything else, no. I'd say really just keep maybe a Plated Beetle or a Homunculus. Definitely keep Mountain Giant. Keep Twilight Drake, and maybe some heal. But Hooked Reaver is not actually that good into non-aggro matchups because it'll take a while for you to get to 7/7, so don't keep him. Yeah, that's basically the overview of the deck. It does pretty well into a lot of matchups, but does very poorly into some other ones. Basically being Mage, Warrior, and Hunter. You get smacked by those guys. But again, to every other matchup, it's definitely favored for you. Maybe 50%, but I'd say it's actually favored in a lot of these cases, so hopefully you guys play the deck better than I do, especially with the fact that it's a hard-to-learn deck. And my win rate's definitely going up, because into some of those aggro decks, where I'm starting to life tap less, my win rate's starting to go up. So if you guys fix that mistake early on, where you don't always life tap and you keep track of your cards in hand and life total, and keeping the correct cards, because in the beginning I didn't think keeping the 4/4 would ever be good. I thought that it was more late game, but actually, when I started keeping it in my opening hand into aggro decks and playing a 7/7 taunt on turn 4, it was actually really, really helpful. So keep track of your life total, hand total. With the proper mulligans, you can beat bad matchups a lot of the time. Well, not a lot of times, but sometimes, more often than you would be able to otherwise. And this is a very complex deck because of the fact that you have a whole other like resource set in terms of health, and you have to play controlled, but you can also go aggressive and beat down if you need to. So it's flexible. I really like the deck, and if you want to put a ton of time into a deck, I think that this deck has potential to be a good deck because of its flexibility. So yeah, definitely rate this deck highly, and I hope you guys enjoyed the guide. See ya.